Well, good morning and good day, everyone. I'm Wendy Cutler with the Asia Society Policy Institute, and I'm so glad you could join us for what I think is going to be a really interesting conversation on the whole issue of trade enforcement. Before I get to today's program, I did want to highlight an important event we're holding next Wednesday, and that will be on U.S.-China relations. The topic of the webinar will be called China Has Politics Too. And our president of the Asia Society Policy Institute, Kevin Rudd, will be providing opening remarks on the U.S.-China relationship and how China views the U.S.-China relationship, particularly going forward. He'll be joined by Hank Paulson and Josette Sheeran. So we hope you can join us next Wednesday. Details on our website. So now for today's event on trade enforcement. Trade enforcement has been an important topic for many administrations going back, and for this administration as well. It's been a key way for different administrations to show that they're not only focused on negotiating trade agreements, but they're also serious on follow-through and ensuring that the benefits of these trade agreements really come to the American people. Trade enforcement is also a rubric for the United States to address unfair trading practices of our foreign trading partners, regardless of whether they're covered by trade agreements or not. Now, under the Trump administration, we've seen a lot happening on trade enforcement. Aggressive use of our trade laws, some would argue controversial use of our trade laws, and a heavy reliance on tariffs as the preferred tool for responding to trade enforcement infractions. And we're going to discuss today kind of our assessment of the past 4 years and think about what we can offer to a new administration as they try and get their hands around this important issue. Previous administrations have tried different things on trade enforcement, and maybe some of these are worth looking at in more detail as well. Certain administrations have focused on WTO dispute settlement. They have also put a lot of resources into trade enforcement, both at USTR as well as at the Commerce Department. But furthermore, they've put enforcement officials in certain US embassies. And so we're going to discuss all of these issues, including whether the US government, the way it is today, is properly organized to deliver on trade enforcement, whether we have sufficient tools in our trade arsenal to deal with trade enforcement, whether even if we had the best of all tools, if there's not political will, does any of this, how effective can any of this be? And again, what suggestions we can offer the Biden administration with respect to trade enforcement. We have an incredible panel here with us today of trade experts. I've worked with all three of our panelists closely, so I'm really thrilled, and we're going to get to this conversation, I promise, in a minute, but let me quickly introduce our panelists. And their combined experience, I think, will really allow us to share not only a government perspective on these issues, but they also have extensive experience in the private sector as well as in Congress. We're thrilled to have Brian Pomper join us, who's a partner at Akin Gump and heads the Alliance for Trade Enforcement Coalition, which is a group of business groups and U.S. companies advocating for government, to respond to our government to respond to unfair trade practices. And he was also the chief trade counsel at the Senate Finance Committee, where I first met him. Christine Bliss is president of the Coalition of Services Industries. She was a close colleague of mine at USTR. And as many of you know, she was the assistant USTR for services, investment, trade, and e-commerce. So we're very excited to have Christy join us as well. And finally, Tom Wyler, who's now Senior Vice President for Global Strategy at PSP Capital, is with us. Before that, he was at the Commerce Department and was a counselor for Commerce Secretary Penny Pritzker, and frankly, the guy when it came to trade policy for Secretary Pritzker. And I had the honor, along with Tom, to serve on a task force which produced the recent report, Making Foreign Policy Work Better for the Middle Class. And this report includes some recommendations and insights on trade and trade enforcement that we hope we can get to during this program. So before I start the questions, I just wanted to say the last 15 minutes or so, we'll take questions from the viewers. So I urge you to think of what you want to ask. And if you can submit your questions through the chat function on YouTube or the comment function on Facebook, we can get to them. Okay, so now let's get to the program. And let me start with the first question. And I was kind of alluding to that in my opening remarks. We've had a busy 4 years on the trade front, including on the trade enforcement front. And I would ask each panelist, and let me start with Brian, when you look back over the past 4 years, what has worked, what hasn't worked, and what improvements could be made?
Well, thanks, Wendy, and thanks to the Asia Society for inviting me to speak here. It's always nice to be on a panel with friends. So I would say this, as you said, trade enforcement is always a topic that is brought to any administration. I always like to say trade enforcement is like motherhood and apple pie of trade policy. It's not controversial. We're just talking about making sure other governments live up to the obligations they've made to us, making sure they treat our companies and our investors fairly. What could be controversial about that? I think the Trump administration, like many administrations, has done some good and some bad. I think probably a criticism you will hear very frequently among policymakers, and certainly the Biden campaign and transition has made this, or Biden has made this, and in the private sector you hear this too, is that one of the problems with the Trump administration approach to trade policy is that it does not feel like it has been strategic. It has been episodic, transactional, kind of one-off. There hasn't been a real accounting for the pluses and minuses for actions that were taken. I know an obvious example would be the China 301 tariffs, which of course the Trump administration put in place. And one of the criticisms has been, has there been any accounting of the harm that those tariffs have caused? And what is the real strategy here to get China to actually or make the changes to their economy that we want? So, what can we learn about that? I think the theme for me when we talk about trade enforcement is having a consistent message across the government to try to get our trading partners, again, to live up to these obligations. This is why the Alliance for Trade Enforcement was formed, actually, was to try to call attention to these issues and to try to get all the arms of the government singing from the same song sheet when we're talking to our trading partners to treat our companies fairly.
Well, thanks for that. Christy, maybe I can follow up with you. When you look at the enforcement record of the Trump administration, at least in the beginning, there was a lot of talk about manufacturing and less talk about services. But I think, over the 4 years, we've seen more focus on services and, frankly, more disputes in the services areas and more concerns about our trading partners not living up to their services commitments. So how would you assess the Trump track record, particularly with a focus on the services area?
Well, thanks, Wendy. And again, thanks so much for the invitation from the Asia Society to participate. And it's great to have the opportunity to be on the panel with you, Wendy, and with Brian and with Tom, and get to share thoughts with you. I think my initial comment would be that when we talk about enforcement, and I think, Wendy, you've made this comment yourself, we're really talking about a pretty broad spectrum of actions. We're not just talking about the traditional kind of bringing challenges, whether it be in the WTO or under FTA dispute settlement. We're looking at a whole broad scope of activity. And I would include, because I think this is very important, the opportunity to settle issues bilaterally or perhaps regionally in the context of trade negotiations, as well as separate talks. So I just wanted to make that point, and interested in others' views, but I think one of the things that's important going forward, to add on to what Brian's comments, which I agree with, is we really need to take a very broad kind of definition to what enforcement means. Second comment I wanted to make is that when we went into the Trump administration, we were coming off of a very active Obama administration on the enforcement front. So, and obviously one of the huge differences between the Obama administration and Trump administration was the reliance on WTO dispute settlement. So obviously in the Obama administration, a great number of WTO dispute settlement cases were brought. And also from the services perspective, there were a number of other outlets to try and deal with issues. For example, you had the TPP negotiations, you had the TISA negotiations, and you also had the BIT negotiations with China. So I just mentioned those because I think when we think about enforcement, it's important not to forget that there are those other opportunities to resolve issues. In terms of the Trump administration and specific comments, I would totally agree with Brian. The observation that's been made that there does seem to be a lack of consistent, coherent strategy, really from the beginning of the administration, in China in particular, but I would also add India in that regard. So I think that is something that certainly from a services perspective has been very concerning. On the other hand, on the plus side, there was the USMCA negotiations, which, as I said, I think certainly from services and digital perspective, we saw that as an opportunity to resolve some issues in the course of the negotiations. So I would put that in the plus side. I would also, giving credit to the Trump administration, say that they made more aggressive use of GSP leverage certainly in the services area, but also in the goods area. And there was some limited success there. And I think Indonesia is the example of more of a success story, not 100%, but certainly to some degree. I think India has not been the same success story using GSP leverage, but just to give credit where credit is due. I think from a services perspective, the new reliance on 301 and the resulting tariffs has been extremely concerning. And although you wouldn't traditionally think of it, the tariffs that have been imposed in the context of the China 301 case have had an adverse effect on services industries and those suppliers that rely on many of the goods that were subject to tariffs to provide their services. So tariffs has been a concern. Overuse of tariffs has been a concern. The other thing I wanted to flag that has been concerning to us has been the over-reliance on national security as a justification for taking action. And even though services are not directly affected, certainly to the reliance on 232 and actions under that provision are an example of that. But with respect to China, while we absolutely, as an organization, support strong action against China, I think there's a really fine line to walk there in terms of how far you stretch that national security justification, and particularly in the investment area. And I know Tom, in particular from his commerce days, is particularly knowledgeable in that regard as well as in other areas of trade. I know I'm long-winded, so maybe I should cut off there, but I do have specific ideas and thoughts for the Biden administration. I just briefly, I think certainly I have to put in a plug for not losing sight of the importance of services. I agree with you, Wendy, that at the beginning there was an overemphasis on manufacturing, not that it's not important, but a lack of recognition of how important services are to manufacturing. And that's really the argument that we made from the beginning of the Trump administration, and to agriculture as well. Second, I think the degree to which COVID has dramatically increased the rate of digitization and the importance of not doing anything that's going to slow things down. At the same time, we certainly support the notion of really putting a laser focus on improving our domestic situation, providing adequate training to workers so that they're prepared for the jobs of the future and they're not left behind. But I think in our view, pursuing an active trade strategy is not inconsistent with also pursuing a very aggressive domestic strategy that improves the situation for workers. Let me stop there. I do have other ideas, including really endorsing the idea of greater coordination in preferably in the White House of enforcement.
Okay, well, yeah, we'll get to that.
Let me stop there.
Questions, but you put a lot on the table, and that's great. Let me turn to Tom for a minute. With your former commerce hat on, I'd be very interested in your perspective. I mean, the Commerce Department plays such an important role in trade enforcement. We've seen more and more of Wilbur Ross and Commerce. I'm sure a lot of people didn't know about Commerce's role in Section 232 investigations on export controls and related measures there, as well as anti-dumping countervailing duty, where now currency is an actionable item under our countervailing duty laws. So when you look at the past 4 years, what do you think worked or didn't work, and how, what would you share with the Biden administration in terms of improving enforcement efforts?
Sure. Well, first of all, thanks, Wendy, for hosting this panel and for having me on, and Brian and Christy, thank you as well. I guess, look, I'll try not to be too long-winded about it. I guess what I'd say is, interestingly enough, I suppose that I would argue that if I had to be in a position to say something that they've done well, I would say that the thing that they've done well is the same as the thing that I think they've done poorly, right? And to an extent, what they've done is they've put a spotlight on these broader enforcement challenges that we've had for a long time. The world has obviously changed since we started thinking about trade enforcement as a government. And the tools themselves, in certain instances, may be fine, but the perception of those tools has not been. And so I think that what the Trump administration has done well is demonstrated that we need to focus more at a political level on enforcement, or else the support for trade is going to dwindle. What I think they've not done well is how they've actually executed that, right? I think the over-reliance on 201, certainly the over-reliance on 232 and 301. I think across the board, sort of the legal basis that they have deployed to support some of their actions has been troublesome. And I think it's been controversial. I think it's been controversial in the United States within the trade policy community. And I certainly think it's been poorly received at times with our allies. I think everybody on this panel has at times had the sometimes privileged, sometimes not, of sitting across the table from allies and explaining that the way we approach trade enforcement is not political. Those arguments are going to be much, much harder to make in the future. Now, maybe that's okay. Maybe that's something that we should think about better ways to embrace it. But the sort of yo-yo type pulling forward and pulling back and forth on some of these, and we talked about it before, or Brian mentioned it, sort of the lack of strategy around some of the use of these trade tools has been challenging and deeply unpredictable, both to the private sector and to the public sector, and to other governments and to allies. But I think at the end of the day, if I was going to say something that the Trump administration has done well, I think they've created a dynamic that is going to hold all of us and future governments' feet to the fire on trying to think about new ways to make sure that we don't just talk about enforcement and do it effectively, and frankly, do it quickly.
Well, great. Brian, maybe I can turn to you. Christy talked a bit about services. Intellectual property protection is extremely important as well. In this area in particular, I would note the special 301 exercise, which was, in my mind, like an enforcement tool, that if you could highlight the IPR practices of other countries, that would be a way to kind of put the spotlight on them and, could pave the way for trade action if certain issues weren't resolved. And I'd be interested in your views on whether that approach is something that should be looked at in other sectors. Do you think it's an effective approach? I mean, I can say from my point of view, and all of these reports over the years, I think initially they provided a lot more leverage, and then countries kind of got used to them, and they didn't like to be named and shamed in these reports, but it wasn't the end of the world. So I just throw that over to you, and particularly in the IPR area, where we're probably going to have more and more disputes, not only under our trade agreements, but more broadly. What can we do in that sector, and are there trade tools that we can respond to in the IPR area against countries that are not respecting IPR and not enforcing, their IPR obligations or laws?
Yeah, thanks, Wendy. I appreciate it. It's a good question, and I agree with your foundational statement that the reports at first it's a shock. The countries they don't want to be on it, but over time they live with it. But I think it does illustrate the point that I think all three of us have mentioned. Really, all four of us have specifically, which is that the tools that are available are really only as good as the political will that's backing them up. So you have this 301 report, and I think part of the reason why countries have gotten comfortable remaining on the report for years and years really is, they've learned that they can be on the report and the consequences really aren't all that bad for them. I think it was one of the bills that passed surrounding a Trade Promotion Authority in 2015, the Trade Enforcement Facilitation Act, I think, created this because I think the 301 report was perceived as being a little bit stale in this sense. And there were countries that, India being a good example, that had been on the priority watch list, which is kind of the naughty list of the 301. It's the naughtiest of the naughty list for 301. It had been on there basically years. So the idea was, let's create special reports, require action plans by USTR when countries are on the priority watch list for at least a year. And these action plans are going to have, guidelines and benchmarks, and it have to be delivered to the trade committees. And that was 2015. I think that was a great tool, right? It's a new tool to use, a new enforcement tool. But I don't know that we've really seen much of anything really coming from it. And again, I think it's because it's not about the tool per se, the 301 report, the action plans, any other kind of tool we have. It's about what the federal government is going to do to back up the tool and really use the tool effectively to get at this enforcement problem. So that's my general response.
So, building on that and comments by all three speakers, maybe we can kind of shift to this idea: is the U.S. government really organized properly to do an effective job on trade enforcement? Brian's emphasized the need for political will or political attention to the importance of trade enforcement. Christy has mentioned, issues of lack of coordination. So Tom, I'm going to start with you, because one of the key recommendations coming out of the report I mentioned earlier, making foreign policy work better for the middle class, in the trade section, we went ahead and recommended the establishment of an enforcement czar in the National Economic Council. And the idea would be that such a person could help develop a strategy and coordinate, the different activities in different agencies. So can you, share your views on why this is needed, what such a person could do, and maybe shed some light and kind of other ideas that were floated before we came to this recommendation.
Yeah, no, thanks, Wendy. Look, I think it's a really important point, and to some extent, all three of us, or all four of us, really have touched on this issue this morning, and certainly in countless other fora. We have an accountability gap, right? And when you talk to trade professionals, and Wendy, I know you and I have heard this a lot since the report came out, and it for a lot of reasons, I think one of which because it was pretty good, got a lot of attention. Is that, oh no, you have it wrong, actually, that our trade enforcement works pretty well most of the time. But that's always from trade policy folks like frankly, the people on this panel and probably many of the people in the audience. But that actually is not well understood by the country. And I'm not talking about sort of the Jay Leno man on the street type interviews. I'm talking about, CEOs of companies. I'm talking about people who care about trade issues. They don't know who to talk to. They don't know who's responsible for trade enforcement. There are good historical reasons why there are certain trade authorities at USTR, certain trade authorities at Commerce, and certain trade authorities at the USITC, right? There are good reasons for that. I don't think our recommendation, I know our recommendation was not suggesting that we strip all those authorities away from those agencies and consolidate them in one place. We talked about that. We thought about that, and for, I think, good reasons, decided that wasn't the right idea. But we need to, I suppose, effectively harness this point that Brian keeps coming back to of political will. I think there needs to be a person who is relatively well known or relatively high profile enough that they are accountable for trade enforcement. They're accountable to the president. They're accountable to Congress. They're accountable to the American people. I think in our context of our recommendation, Wendy, this person will be responsible probably with the USTR and with the Secretary of Commerce for issuing reports to Commerce on a relatively consistent basis, probably appearing before Commerce to talk about enforcement actions. And the goal here is to really put a spotlight, not only on what administrations are doing, but on who's responsible for it and who's responsible for coordinating that activity across the government. And I think, all of us have seen that when there's a high-level official who has got that type of role, it's remarkable how much more gets done. And I think that would be tremendously useful. And I guess I'm a little bit hesitant to say that it is entirely about perception, because I do think that there are legitimate enforcement gaps, right? I think about how hard it was for us, Wendy, back in our day to deal with problems of manufacturing overcapacity coming out of China, right? No matter what we tried to do on enforcement, it was such a challenging and frankly globalized distortion that we really didn't have the tools. So I wouldn't say that it's entirely about perception, but it is partially about perception, and it's partially about catalyzing government action. So I think there's a number of vectors around which this idea of a trade enforcement czar, why it becomes important. But I do think part of it is about perception in harnessing political will. And I think, Wendy, what you were referring to is we had talked at various times about whether or not this person, this trade enforcement czar, should be the Secretary of Commerce. At various times, I will say that I have gone back and forth on this idea. I think there is merit to the idea of somebody who is confirmed by the Senate having that responsibility. Presumably a White House czar would not be. The chair of the NEC has got a significant amount on their plate as it is, without huge amount of resources, and somebody who works for the person who runs the NEC is maybe not senior enough to be sort of the face of this. And so I think there's benefits to having somebody who is well known, has the stature of a Secretary of Commerce, and frankly can be held accountable the way the Secretary of Commerce can. On the other hand, there's nothing quite as effective as having somebody who's in the White House as the ear of the president on a daily basis, pushing this type of action forward. And I also appreciate that probably the last thing any of us would want to do with this is create a bureaucratic turf war, which undoubtedly would be the case. if it became the Secretary of Commerce. But look, I think at the end of the day, if you were to ask me to tell you what I think is important about this, I think it's somebody who is in a sufficiently senior role that they can effectively catalyze the government and be held responsible to some extent publicly for work not getting done and for work not having a spotlight put on it. So I'll stop there and let others chime in, but that's the crux of the idea.
Great. So thanks for sharing that. Maybe Christy, I could ask you, what do you think of this recommendation? And one question I'd ask you, as someone I worked at USTR with, in some ways, most of our job, or large parts of our job, focused on trade enforcement. As you mentioned, even in developing a negotiating proposal, you're always thinking of enforcing, getting rid of unfair trade practices and enforcing, our rights and obligations. And so, I'd just be interested in your view, like, where does trade enforcement start? Where does it end? And what functions, if you think this is a good idea, do you think a czar at the White House in charge of enforcement, could do?
Well, thanks, Wendy. And I really want to start my comments just by acknowledging the very, very important role that you and Tom have pointed out that commerce plays on the enforcement side. And I have to say that on services issues, commerce has been tremendously helpful in terms of being responsive to efforts to educate about the importance of services role in manufacturing and agriculture, and the digital space. So, clearly commerce plays a very important role. Treasury does as well with respect to services. So the reason I bring those 2 points up is that I think in looking at a proposal along the lines of what Thomas has outlined, that it's important to think about or consider whether you would want the troika or maybe it's a broader list of USTR commerce and Treasury as well as part of the White House coordination effort. The second thing I would say is that I think, to me, where this idea of lack of coordination and its importance has really arisen is where you're confronting massive countrywide programs that create an unfair market access situation. And obviously, I'm thinking of China, but I'm also thinking of India. And that's where I think this government-wide, whole of government approach could be critically important, because I would argue that our trade tolls are not adequate to really deal with the guts of the practices that unfair practices that China and India in particular are engaging in. So from my perspective, I think the idea of greater coordination, whole of government coordination, makes a lot of sense, particularly when you're dealing with China and India kinds of very broad trade issues. The other point I wanted to make in terms of inadequacy of trade tools is that I think in the services space, we're really confronting a lot of issues where there are no trade rules. So if you don't have trade rules, then really you can have all the tariffs and sanctions at your disposal, and they may not necessarily create the kind of leverage that you need. And so I just raised the question of whether in that kind of context, there may be instances where a whole of government approach may be useful. And just to give you some specifics, I think the rising trend toward digital sovereignty, the absence of widely accepted rules on cross-border trade, and just another very real example that we're facing is the degree to which standards for digitally enabled services are creating new barriers. And there simply are not disciplines like the TBT agreement to deal with those issues. So again, I think Tom's comments are very well placed. I think it's a very interesting idea. And I do think the whole of government approach has some usefulness, particularly in the China-India situations, and also maybe where we're confronting new issues where there are no trade rules.
So let me, Wendy, if I can just quickly say, I know sometimes it is easy to discount these kinds of ideas as just, shuffling responsibilities around, and is that really going to have any impact? I think it's a great idea for many of the reasons people have been saying. I often talk about or remind people that trade enforcement functions were moved from the State Department in 1962 to the precursor of USTR, precisely because of the concern that the kind of business concerns were being lost in the broader diplomatic concerns that state was really focused with during the Cold War at that time. And I think we can all agree that was a good move, right? That was a reorganization of trade functions in the government that actually was a fantastic move, an inspired move. For me, the key to this kind of an approach is you do have somebody who is empowered to organize government enforcement functions across agencies. As Christie's using this term, whole of government, I completely endorse that. What do we mean by that? Well, it's not just Treasury, State, USTR, but it's and commerce, it's state, it's small business administration, it's the embassy officials in country who are talking with at every level of government that our interlocutors in the target country, whatever it is, they're hearing the same talking points, they're hearing the same concerns, and that's all being coordinated. It has to be coordinated, it seems to me, by one central location. My only note of caution is sometimes we do these organizations, we either don't give the official sufficient authority or sufficiently clear guidelines as to what their job is going to be, that it kind of loses the oomph that it's supposed to have. There's long been a proposal to have a chief enforcement officer at USTR. There is, of course, an intellectual property enforcement coordinator that was created, I think the Pro-IP Act in 2008. And that job, I think because the functions are ill-defined, right? They're supposed to do a report every 3 years. Beyond that, there's not much to it. I think it has not really lived up to the potential that we many folks in the IP community had hoped. But so if you create this job in the White House, you're coordinating across agencies, and that person is really empowered to do that. I think that's a really, really interesting idea.
Wendy, can I just chime in? Can I say just two quick things? I would just say, Brian, your point about enforcement authorities shifting from state to the precursor to USTR, really important point. I had not thought about that. The only thing I'd add to it is that at the time, there was also a reason why it was shifted to the White House and the executive office of the president for exactly some of what we're talking about now, is that there was this idea that we needed a centralized, empowered enforcement authority back in the early 60s, right? There was this understanding that having those authorities sitting in the executive office of the president was useful. So I think it's a great point. I had not thought of it, but I think it's a great point. And the other thing I'd say is about having the person empowered. Totally agree. And I think it's part of why I am really hesitant around the idea of this role just being handed over to the head of the NEC or to the Deputy National Security Advisor for International Economics, because both of those are really senior jobs with considerable authority, but very, very full plates as it is. And this is a big job. And so if you want it to be dealt with the way we envision, I really struggle with the idea of just putting more food on somebody's plate. That doesn't tend to get the outcomes that we're all talking about.
If I can just follow up with the question, something I'm having a hard time getting my hands around. I get it when we're trying to go after an unfair trade practice, that a country is pursuing, and an all of government approach and thinking of different tools and how to coordinate things and coming up with a strategy is critical. But what do you do with existing administration of trade laws, particularly those that are not politicized, that are, that have their own investigation timelines, have their own input from the ITC? How would, in just thinking this through, would these types of actions also in your minds, come under the purview of someone like this, or do they need to somehow be separated? I don't know who wants to take that question. Brian, I'm looking at you.
I feel like I've talked so much already, Wendy. Do I think it would be in the purview? I mean, if you're talking about the trade remedy, AD/CVD laws, those, or 337, I feel like they are quasi-judicial, and they should be quasi-judicial. They should not. I would really hate to see them politicized in that sort of a way. In terms of self-initiating, maybe there is a role for that. The 201s, by the way, I think it was Christy who mentioned the national security 232s being overused. Man, do I agree with that. I actually, personally, I think nothing has infuriated our allies and hindered the ability of the Trump administration to work with our allies on China or other trade priorities than those 232 investigations. And I understand their motivation that they had for instituting those. Tom, you mentioned that the struggle of dealing with China's overcapacity and how do you really get your arms around that? I know that's what was motivating the Trump administration. I just think that 232 approach has been very damaging and has really made it, again, look like a political exercise. So I worry about politics bleeding over into these initiatives that are, I mean, they're not necessarily supposed to be political in the way that we're talking about some of, they're not supposed to be political.
So this is,
sorry.
1 second. Oh, I'm sorry, Christy.
No.
This is the only thing I'd say is that's exactly where I was, in my opening comments, Brian, where, what they did well is also what they did badly, right? I really struggle with the overuse of 232, and I think it was deeply damaging, but I also think it was demonstrative of our tools and our processes not being adequate. So I'll stop there. Sorry, Christy, I didn't mean to jump in.
No, that's okay. Just quickly, a couple things in reaction to some of the comments. So one is that I think, obviously, this is a very, very delicate kind of new initiative to come up with the right balance between leaving existing authorities alone and trying to, at the same time, ensure better coordination. And in that context, I would say that I do think, and I'm biased, obviously, but that the honest broker role of USTR, it's important to ensure that is somehow preserved. And to some degree, that may overlap with its function, but I do think that's very important. And the other thing I would say is that in my mind, where the whole of government and where, to the extent I've thought about it, really, really has the greatest importance is where you're dealing with these broad sets of problems in countries like China and India, where you really do need a more whole of government approach. Lastly, I would just say that totally agree with Tom's comment. And I didn't mean to imply by mentioning Treasury, Commerce, and USTR and state, of course, that other agencies don't have a role. They clearly do. I just meant that there might be in crafting this a role, a lead role for certain agencies in, whether it's monitoring, coming up with recommendations. That's all I was saying, but I totally agree that other agencies should have a voice and a role as well.
Maybe now we can kind of shift to the theme of the adequacy of tools and really what I would call like penalties, right? Because the Trump administration has relied on tariffs. So one question I would have for the panel, are there other things we could be doing instead of tariffs or in addition to tariffs to either penalize a country and try and create a level playing field in responding to an unfair action they're taking, but also are there tools we could be using that really haven't been used over the past 4 years? In other words, looking more broadly for where our leverage is with certain countries. I mean, I recall during my career really trying to use kind of leaders meetings or summit meetings as action forcing events, where you would look at the calendar, you would back up, months and think about how you can solve your issue leading up to that event particularly if there is a leader-to-leader meeting, you do have some leverage if the other country, has no interest in having this on that agenda. So I just throw that out as an idea. Are there other things that, looking ahead to a Biden administration, that you would recommend, maybe things we've forgotten about or new ideas that we can briefly discuss? And at the same time, I'd love to turn to the audience. And there are a couple of questions, but please send them in and we'll be turning to you guys quickly soon.
I guess I'll jump in and take that. I also say one thing, just sort of, I think it fits with this, but it also reverts a little bit to the previous question. Maybe it's a little controversial, and maybe that's good. Maybe we need a little controversy because we all are agreeing with
Go for it, Tom.
So I guess I'll just say, look, I personally agree that having a series, many enforcement actions that are quasi-judicial in nature is really important and beneficial. It benefits us on the enforcement side, but it also frankly benefits us on the political side. And many who haven't been in government don't appreciate how useful it is to be able to sit across from counterparts and say, I got nothing to do with that, right? It's actually quite advantageous. What I will say though is I struggle to some extent thinking about that after the last 4 years, because I'm not sure we'll ever be able to credibly claim that again. And to be honest, I think that it's possible, if not probable, after seeing the last 4 years, that all of our, or many of our quasi-judicial processes will in the future be attacked and torn down and sort of demonstrated as, well, they're only quasi-judicial for as long as the White House is going to allow them to be quasi-judicial. And so as much as I think that that is a good approach, I do wonder whether or not, given the last 4 years and given the realization that that may come around again at some point, sort of that approach, is this the right time to think about whether or not, or to rethink how some of those tools work? And, do we just need to think about new structures, new barriers around them? Do we make them more political because they're going to be political anyway? And I'm putting that out there because I think it's a complicated, knotty problem. I don't claim to have an answer, but I do worry that the premise of quasi-judicial processes on enforcement that are outside the purview of the executive branch and political forces may just not really hold water going forward. And so I don't know how to wrestle with that, but I think it's important to think about. As far as your question, Wendy, about are there other avenues? Look, I think leader summits are great, and I'll be brief on this. The one thing I'd say is that on some of the broader systemic challenges like excess capacity, leader summits weren't going to do it. And so I think we need to, and maybe this is where, to some extent, where Christy started, to develop some new, less sort of blunt force tools, more scalpel-like tools. The idea of financial sanctions, I know makes a lot of people sort of very nervous, and I appreciate why, or using export controls more aggressively. I'm not sure. And again, I think it opens a Pandora's box that we should be very, very nervous about. But I think a broad discussion about more precise tools is probably warranted and timely at the moment on some of these systemic challenges.
Christy, if I can just ask you, as more disputes and more unfair trade practices surface in the services area, there have been some complaints from agriculture and manufacturing that, if tariffs are going to be imposed in response to these other countries going forward, let's say with the digital services tax, for example, that manufacturing and agriculture interests would kind of have to pay the price for the services industry's concerns. So I would ask you, are there things we could be exploring in the services areas as, responses in terms of like not granting licenses or other kind of creative means that would, could provide important leverage or incentive for other countries to deal with their services issues?
Well, thanks for that question, Wendy, and it's a really tough one. first I would say that, certainly there is the established principle precedent rule in the WTO dispute settlement procedures that you can have cross retaliation. So it's not as though the idea of other sectors suffering collateral damage when tariffs are imposed in response to trade barriers in a particular sector is a new issue. It's not. And there certainly is authority, I think, to pursue that, certainly in a WTO case. So, and I would argue that why should services be any different than goods or agriculture in terms of a response to an unfair trade case? Services companies can suffer as a result, as is the case in China tariffs, as a result of the imposition of tariffs in response to largely goods or ag issues. So I just think off the bat, it's important to make that point. But secondly, on your point about what other things might be explored, 301 does allow for exploration of some other areas. But I think as the services group, we have been very hesitant to go down that road. And one of the main reasons is worry about reciprocal action. That if we start to go down the road of withdrawing licenses or imposing new charges, then our trading partner could mirror our action. And that the purpose we're trying to achieve in resolving the trade dispute could be defeated. So I think we've been generally reluctant to think about going down that route. But on the other hand, I think I would have to just say it probably depends most on the facts of the case and whether in a particular country there really is no other alternative. I would point to GSP leverage, and I know we don't know whether or not the GSP program is going to be renewed, but that's another area that you might look to. And then there are other areas of potential authorizations that might be looked at in other agencies, or competition policy that might be looked at. So I do think there are alternatives, but I think it's a very tricky issue that we have to be very careful in considering.
I think that could be a job for a new enforcement czar to kind of coordinate, really trying to develop, review, develop, and come up with some creative new tools, not just in services, but across the board, because I think we've all seen, we've witnessed tariffs, and I think we've seen there are a lot of questions with regard to their cost and effectiveness. Brian, I'm sure you probably have a number of things you want to respond to, but I wanted to just put another question on your plate from a viewer who was just asking the question, given that the Biden administration wants to place a lot of emphasis on rebuilding relationships with allies and partners, how does this square with taking trade enforcement actions going forward as well? Can both be done at the same time?
Yeah, I absolutely think, the old expression is walk and chew gum at the same time. We don't, even with our closest allies, we have disagreements that need to be worked out. I think there are certainly things a Biden administration coming in is going to want to do. I think looking at a lot of those 232s is going to be something they're really going to have to look at. I think our allies, and I think that would really do a lot towards soothing some of the wounds that our allies feel like they've gotten over the course of the last few years. And I just want to make a point here, because I'm often reminded by my friends in the Trump administration at USTR that it's not like they haven't tried to work with our allies on a variety of issues, including most prominently with respect to China. My point back to them is, well, it's hard for you to reach your hands out to your allies and try to kind of work together when with your other hand, you're, beating the snot out of them with a baseball bat with 232 or other stuff. So I do think you can have a good, close, respectful relationship with these countries while still raising issues and pressing them hard on issues of trade policy where our industries have concerns.
Can I just say, I know that this is not a panel to sort of attack Trump trade policies, and I don't mean to make this point, but I'll second what you were saying there, Brian. And I would say even almost in some ways more challenging is that you're reaching your hand out, trying to work with them on XYZ. And it's not even that you're beating the snot out of them with the other hand. Sometimes that's true, but almost in some ways worse is that they don't know what the other hand's about to do. Right. And that I think has created real challenges for our allies. And I've heard about it all the time is they never were really sure where they stood or what was coming next. And I think that created real difficulty.
That I think speaks to that lack of strategy that we've talked about.
And can I just add, I think Tom's point is very well taken. Also transparency and coordination and lack of transparency. And I also just wanted to fully endorse, and I think it is related to Wendy's comment about using summits, whether it's G20, G7, as a route to resolve disputes, but also working closely with allies. I think that's incredibly important. And last point is one tool, an area, it's not a tool, but it's an important venue, is we haven't talked much about the WTO.
And that was going to be my last question.
Okay.
Speaker, just because we've had a trade enforcement event and no one has mentioned the WTO appellate body. Now, I did make it clear that I didn't want that to be a focus because I know there are separate webinars going to this in detail. But can we just have parting comments from each of you about where does the WTO rules and dispute settlement fit in all of this? Is it still a useful tool? Brian.
Yes, I think it is. I mean, look, there are problems with how the WTO dispute settlement system works. They are longstanding. Again, in the interest of being fairness, Wendy, I'm a Midwesterner, and I always have to emphasize my fairness because that's how Midwesterners are. It was really the Obama administration that first held up a WTO appellate judge, right? And so while I don't know how I feel about that specific tactic, I do think that the concerns are longstanding and important. Having said that, I think that the dispute settlement system still works, can work. Look, I'd point to Boeing Airbus. It's a long-standing issue, but I will say it feels like they're moving towards some kind of a resolution here, and I'm hopeful this can be one of Ambassador Lighthizer final legacy issues here, is to resolve that long-standing dispute through the settled means of the dispute settlement system at the WTO. I hope we can find a way to really rejuvenate it and really make it work.
Tom?
Look, I would just say that if I put on my hopeful hat, there is nothing I think that spurs reform and rejuvenation like a near-death experience.
Oh, okay. Christy, top that.
Yeah, I can't top that. No, but I would just say, I think I am hopeful that some of the appellate body issues can be worked out, because I do think there are solutions out there that have been suggested, and obviously room for creativity. So, and I think from a services perspective, the WTO dispute settlement and the appellate body is incredibly important in terms of enforcing GATS rules. And the other thing I would say is that I think it's very important that the Biden administration go in, clear out the underbrush, reassert leadership in the WTO, and support a new director general. And hopefully it will be Ngozi from Nigeria. I think she has great leadership qualities, and I think it would be great to have a woman in charge of the WTO, if I can make that pitch. So I think there is hope, and I think the WTO is a very, very important component going forward.
Can I just look? I mean, I didn't mean to be tongue-in-cheek with my answer, because what I will say is that I think it is underrated and underappreciated how significant of an accomplishment the creation of the WTO was. I mean, really a tremendous achievement. 30 years ago now? I guess not quite, but really significant. And I think letting it wither and die because we are dealing with a materially different global economy would be a mistake. And I'm hopeful that if there's a silver lining in what's gone on over the last couple of years, it's the idea that there's sort of an understanding and a commitment to change, because it has to happen. There's a lot of problems, but letting it wither and die would be, I think, unfortunate in the extreme.
Well, with that, let me conclude the event. Let me just say I couldn't agree more with Christy. I think one of the earliest actions that a Biden administration can take to show its determination to really work in the WTO would be to join the consensus at this point for the selection of Director General Ngozi as head of the WTO. But in addition, I would just say that it would be great if the United States could put concrete proposals on the table on how to fix the appellate body system. There, a lot of other countries have been putting forward proposals trying to address some of our concerns. There are a lot of experts in the United States who've given a lot of thought to this. So I think there's a lot of rich material to draw from. But I think that would be a very constructive early step. I'm under no illusion that such a negotiation on improvements to the appellate body could be done in short order. But I think by tabling a proposal and actually triggering a negotiation and being clear to our trading partners what we want in terms of fixing, a broken body would go, I think, a long way forward. So with that, thank you, Brian, Tom, Christy. I thought we had an excellent discussion on trade enforcement. Couldn't thank you more. Thank you to our viewers for joining us. And again, hopefully you can join us next Wednesday for an incredible event, I think, on U.S.-China relations, but looking from a China perspective on how they're viewing the relationship and particularly how to move the relationship forward. Thank you very much, everyone. Have a great day.
Thanks, all. Stay safe and healthy.
Bye.